No, it's very simple actually. It's not a virus. So there is separation that happens. So there is this sense that, so the separation is an energetic thing, and it happens at 1 or 2 years old, and it's most probably genetic. And then that separation happens, and there's two initial emotions or feelings that come with that separation. The first one is that you feel like you've been abandoned by God or wholeness. You've been abandoned by yourself. And this isn't conscious, this is unconscious. So there is a sense that you've been kicked out of Eden. So that you did something wrong and that something left you, and you don't know why. Then you feel scared because suddenly, rather than just being everything, you're suddenly in here looking at all these things that you're in relationship with. And so you feel afraid of all these things. They're very similar feelings. And this is where the seeker starts. So then the seeker feels like it's someone, feels like it has pleasure and pain, and it seeks for love and tries to avoid fear. And that's what its whole personality is based on. Seeking love and avoiding fear. So it seeks pleasure, and this is what Buddhists say. This is this is in so many of the traditions, that it's all about the pleasure seeking and the avoiding pain. And the pleasure in which you seek, you'll notice if you really examine it, is always love, and the pain in which you avoid is always fear. And all of those things, the rage, the anger, there can be natural rage, no, not natural rage, but there can be natural anger, there can be natural feelings, but most of the feelings, while there's separation, always come back to these things. So there can be natural jealousy, but there also can be identified jealousy, which goes on for years, and it's really agonizing and suspicious and untrusting. And that, when you boil it down, you'll notice that it comes from fear of losing something, and from fear of losing love and not getting love, like all of them. So say if you want to kill someone, if you want to murder someone, it will either come to the two feelings underneath it all, of fear or lack, of wanting love or being scared. So maybe you murder them for money, or you murder them for a lover, or you murder them out of fear. It will always be. And there'll be all these complicated stories and emotions on top. And finally, what most of society live in is they live in opposite stories. So they're always trying to deny that. And what they'll do is, if they feel lack, they will then tell everyone how wonderful they are and how wonderful their life is. If they feel afraid, they'll then be telling about racism and whose fault, or hatred of another. But they won't even acknowledge that underneath there's all these feelings. On the surface, we're always telling the opposite stories to try and make ourselves feel better. So we feel afraid, so we blame a part of society, we blame people for it. We feel lack of love, and there can be lots of different things to feeling lack of love. You feel lack of love, and on the surface you could be having lots of lovers, lots of sex. So it could be loads of different things. It's always, and on the surface you're always trying to balance it out. So whatever you feel underneath, you're trying to balance it out, but it's very unbalanced. So you're trying to tell the story of how much you're loved, or how fantastic you are, or how much better you are than your neighbour, in order to feel loved. And that's how most humans are living, is in that surface level of stories. And they're repeating the story of how the other person was wrong and how they're right. And the whole time they're uncomfortable, but because they're so up here, they can't even feel the discomfort in their body. Or they're telling the story of how much they dislike this or dislike that, or they're telling the story of how they're going to travel the world and do all these things. And the reason you're telling the story to yourself of travelling the world is to feel more loved. It's got nothing to do with what's actually happening, but you're always trying to compensate. This is why it's so great to bring awareness to these two basic feelings, and seeing how so much of your life has been based on trying to avoid fear and trying to get love. Like, I remember even when I got into Buddhism, in a way, I remember that Buddhism was my first access to, I was into psychology and other things, but never to the Eastern philosophies of no self and enlightenment. And in Buddhism, I even remember when I first got into Buddhism, I remember it being so important to be seen as a Buddhist. And it was more important, in a way, to be a Buddhist than it was for the teachings. I was so identified with what I wanted to seem like to other people. And I remember like these stories that would repeat in me of like what I wanted to tell people, or how I wanted people to see it, or the way I wanted to dress, or people to ask. Like, because I saw it as another way to get love. Thankfully it was this subject, so the subject like... And then like this completely goes, this kind of story making to make you feel more balanced. So you tell hatred about people because you felt vulnerable to them, and you keep saying how it's their fault. Really, it's no one's fault. You know, when we look at politics or the EU, we always come to, it's impossible to sit anywhere. We can have preferences. I prefer to be in the EU, but it's nobody's fault ultimately. I can even understand it from people that are really doing it from hate and racism. There's no... But the reason that the mind keeps telling the story of hatred, of whose fault it is because it's actually trying to balance out its fear that it feels underneath. If it can blame someone, then it feels like the fear will go away. It's not even conscious of that, but it feels more in control if it can blame someone and put all the blame on someone. But after 20 years, 30 years of doing this, it's encouraged craziness of the mind. And the only way to look at this is to look at what's underneath. Not to stay with the surface stories, but what's underneath those stories. And that one that's looking isn't you, that's an experience in the dream, but that one feels like it's so bound inside itself. And while it feels like it has free will, it can, like I say to you, feel the feeling, it can move its attention, but it's not independently happening. So beautiful. People even tell non-duality to make themselves feel better. I remember doing that. Like I would feel so much hatred towards someone, I'd be like, they're not the doer, they're not the doer, they're not the doer. But it never works. And then eventually I began to see that every time I was telling anything, it was always to compensate because I felt hurt in some way. I was telling I'm not the doer. So as soon as some story came, I always knew it was like, Lisa's suffering. Oh, okay, I just feel fear. Okay, it's lack. And the more that stops happening, and it sort of goes back to the source, it just acts it out less. It just stops being addicted to all these stories. But this isn't about waking up, because the awakeness is there no matter what. But it in the appearance of the cage, it makes the cage so empty. Takes out all the crap. Like when you start in this subject, the cage is totally filled with hatred or fear or anxiety. It takes all that stuff out. The last bit is grace, so that energy falling away, because that's all in the cells. And in a way, the bit of you feeling the feelings is grace too, but I'm just splitting it up better so you guys can understand that you won't get yourself to liberation. It's a happening. It's a happening. Even in a way, you exploring yourself is grace as well. It's a happening. So even saying the last bit is grace is just a con, because it's too hard for me to get it all into words to make sense.